that really ugly situation.
There's a tiny little bit there where the mum kind of comes back into the room and re-engages with the child. And the child pauses just for a second. And I imagine that child saying, "You're a bad bitch." But the child trusts the mum sufficiently based on the previous 10,000 interactions to re-engage. So what you're seeing there is scaffolding. Scaffolding created the relationship trust. So the relationship breaks down. We are not perfect parents. God bless us. You do not need to be a perfect parent. What you need to be is to be the good enough parent. When we see the dynamic and we see individuals who struggle, often they're the individuals who have experienced ugly parenting. And ugly parenting is not always about abuse. It's sometimes just about neglect. It's sometimes just about a lack of interest, a lack of engagement, a lack of attunement in terms of dynamics. There is an American study which produced some really interesting findings a number of years ago. And the contrast is this notion of absent parents, parents who were simply not engaged, not interested, not involved. Their impact on patients who were physically abusive, and the negative psychological effects of absent parents were greater than parents who were physically abusive. And context, as always, impacts upon how individuals experience things. So I was doing some training for staff in my residential secure childcare unit and talking about the impact of physical abuse. And one of the things that came up was guys saying, "Well, my dad hit me and I'm fine. Actually these kids need help a bit more." And I took a little bit of a chance with the guy at lunchtime and said, "Okay, tell me about when your dad hit you. Talk me through kind of the context of it." So he said, "Can you remember?" He said, "Oh yeah, I can remember a couple of occasions." He said, "There was one occasion we were playing in the back garden. I pushed my little sister off her bike and she burst her chin and my dad hit me." I said, "Okay." There was another occasion my cousin and I were playing the matches and we set fire to the living room carpet and my dad hit me. At this point I'm starting to be sympathetic to his dad. But what was critical was his dad loved him. His dad took him fishing. His dad took an interest in him. His dad watched him play football. His dad was an imperfect parent. It's okay to be an imperfect parent, but it's a graduated dynamic in terms of impact. It's also sometimes a dynamic whereby the parent is not critical, but the other adults are critical. If you look at children in residential care, the outcomes for children in residential care, and I have an interest in that area, the single biggest predictor of positive outcomes is a single, stable, continuous emotional reaction with an attuned adult. It's often granny. It's very often granny. But sometimes it is a teacher. Sometimes it's a football coach. Connections matter in terms of dynamics. So what you're looking at is the child's experience, but what happened to the child matter because it creates a template going forward. You are emotionally self-regulated, but you went through a stage in which you were co-regulated with your parent or a significant adult, and you went through a stage of being completely unregulated. So the development of emotional regulation needs somebody critical at critical periods in your life to scaffold you. Otherwise, potentially going forward, you can struggle, or you can struggle when you're under stress. Add trauma to that mix, and we have the impact of trauma and the impact of early childhood adversity and dysfunctional attachments, and you create vulnerability. Because what we need to develop these regulatory capacities is modulated stress. We need exposed to stress. Too little stress will not develop the connections between the limbic centers of your brain and the cortex, which are how you manage stress. Too much stress will simply overwhelm them. So what you need is somebody who is sufficiently attuned to you to provide you with the right level of stress at the right time. And we do that through play. We play with our kids. That's what we do. So one of the things we need to think about in terms of recovery is, do we create opportunities for people to play? Do we create opportunities for people to have fun? Do we create opportunities for people to develop a sense of wonder? How do we create the conditions of nurture that individuals need? Because if we're thinking about the brain, then we're thinking about at points, how do we go back to enable that individual to start to change that worldview, to work way back at that level of the brain in terms of what we're trying to do. And there's multiple strategies we can do that, and for some individuals, these individuals need access to very specific therapies that will target those aspects of the brain. So we need the relationships, we need the sense of empowerment, we also need access to specific therapies for certain individuals. Because what we're trying to do is enable most individuals most of the time to get into this little window of regulation. And most of us, most of the time, are here. I'm a little bit out with my window of regulation, not because I'm speaking to you, because I'm going to Australia on Sunday, and that always makes me a little anxious. Does that make sense? Because although I had great expectations of getting all sorts of things done this week that I wouldn't need to take work with me, how successful do you think I've been? No. So I've got a little mental to-do list in my head that's making me a little bit anxious. And in some respects, if you're familiar with the drama triangle, I'm occupying the victim box, and I'm trying to position myself in that victim box. And my wife is very much aware of the deficiencies of the drama triangle. Is saying, you volunteered for this shit. You need to own this. And, a bit more empathy would be helpful, but the message is that actually we do a kind of joint, we're good for each other, and I'm very fortunate in that dynamic. So making sense of individuals' journey, how does this impact? How do we make sense of it? How do we enable individuals to make sense of it? So too much stress can create an individual who's trapped in hypervigilance and hyperarousal. And for that individual, using just this example, self-injury can be a means of reducing distress and producing calm. But for another individual who's trapped in dissociation, who's trapped in emotional numbing, self-injury can be a means of creating feeling in a dynamic. What we see and what we need to understand, what we enable people to learn, are that dysfunctional coping patterns reflect an underlying background and underlying history, but they're simply coping strategies. They're not good or bad coping strategies, they're coping strategies. But unless you understand what the individual is coping with and supplant that need for coping, they're going to go back to doing what they're doing because they need to cope. So drug and alcohol services, for example, in Fife, where I used to work, our mental health services wouldn't see somebody who was drinking. They needed to stop drinking to be seen by our mental health services. Now, the person was drinking to cope with their very high levels of trauma and their inability to sleep and their they were self-medicating. So we asked them to stop self-medicating, which they couldn't do. Now, we've learned from that. We have learned from that. We have services that work much more sympathetically and engage much more constructively, but it took us 20 years to learn that was a fucking stupid thing to do because it didn't work. It really didn't work. So understand people's journey, understand how people work. I'm going to show you a little slide and finish on this because, again, it's lovely. First of all, that wasn't the video I intended to show you. That was a different video. I was watching and thinking, oh, buggeration. There's actually a lovely video produced by the same organisation, which is kids actually telling that to you in a way which is really powerful. So I apologise in terms of who we are. You got the narrative, you didn't get the kids, and the kids are cute. So what do we do in terms of trauma-informed practice? We realise the significance of trauma in our population, in our community, in our society. We recognise how it manifests. We start thinking about behaviour through the trauma lens. We think about how we deliver a response, which is trauma-informed. It recognises events, it recognises experience, it recognises effects. We think about the significance of, first of all, reducing re-traumatisation. How do we prevent people from experiencing more trauma? How do we get them to a place of safety? relationship in which that individual can feel safe and learn to recover? And how do we respect resilience and post-traumatic growth? Because one of the really powerful things to take away from this is that there will be individuals in this room with significant trauma, who are functioning, who are smart, who are clever, who are helping others. Trauma is your history, it is not your destiny, as the old phrase goes. But for others, that journey has been more difficult, and what we need to do is to figure out how to support them in their particular journey. Thank you very much for allowing me to spend a bit of time with you today. I've thrown an awful lot of information at you in a very short period of time. I'll send through a whole series of other links. I'll even send you the right video clip, as opposed to the wrong video clip, which would be good. So thank you again. Questions, comments?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, that had you all listening.